All right. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Builders of Web3 show. I'm your host, Antonio Ivanovsky. You can call me AI. I have two very special guests today. I have Jason Frasca and Iain Kerr, and they are co-founders and innovation strategies of their own consulting firm, Emergent Futures Labs. I've been reading Jason and Iain's newsletter on LinkedIn, following them for a while now. They also have their own book, which we will talk about later, I'm sure. And Jason was my professor for entrepreneurship back when I was at Montclair State University. So I'm very excited about today's conversation. So let's get it started. Welcome, Jason. Welcome, Iain.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Antonio.
Do you guys want to maybe start telling me about yourselves a little bit, telling the audience about yourselves? I know you guys are brilliant, and I would love to hear a little more than what I said.
Yeah. Do you want to kick it off, Jason?
Yeah, sure. Just real quick, background is in marketing, digital marketing specifically, and then operational efficiency processes and so forth. And I've had a couple of careers in 9-year careers and along those lines, and then ended up with a successful exit in 2012 from a company that I was a partner in, and then evolved over to teaching professor at Montclair State University, entrepreneurship, marketing, innovation, starting a innovation research lab with Iain called the Mix Lab, where we use we use 3D printing to teach the skills of innovation. So we have this hard skill, soft skill intersection in our lab, and it's also a great prototyping space for students to support their entrepreneurial efforts and collaborations across campus. So that's a bit about my background.
I'm originally from Canada, from Vancouver a long time ago. And my background is I studied philosophy and architecture, and for 20 years or so, I've been part of a kind of interventionist art design collective called Spurse, and we've done a lot of work with communities around ecological innovation and change making, as well as things in the design space at large. And my focus has always been just trying to figure out how to make change happen at different scales, from objects to systems. And I've taught in all sorts of spaces within the university, from art, design, architecture, philosophy, ecology, entrepreneurship, innovation, what have you. And I think, you were saying earlier, Antonio, when we were just talking, like that you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. I think that's a really important thing to be, is that, especially with innovation, where whatever's coming about, the new, like, nobody's a master of it, and so, everybody, shouldn't say everybody, but, it's like a position of being an amateur, and so I really resonate with being proudly a master of nothing and a quasi.
That's good to hear. Yeah, because a lot of times I feel like, and I know I've had this conversation with my wife, she kind of went accounting, data science, and she's like, well, I know a little bit of everything, but she's like, I wish I knew something like where I specialize in something. But I guess there's pros and cons to both. So yeah, that's definitely good to hear you say that.
A quick bit about that. The world has kind of gone back to this generalization, master of none kind of space. 10 years ago, when I had that exit and then was transitioning to university, having run business for 10 years, you have your hands in everything, right? Marketing and sales, and then the actual deliverable product, right? And accounting and so forth, right? But came out and emerged as a jack of all trades. And the world at that time did not value that skill set of having exposure to all of the aspects of business and wanted specificity. They wanted specialists, and I was basically unhireable. So I didn't want to have a business at that time. I was looking for a job, and I was unhireable because I was deemed this kind of jack of all trades, right? But now if we fast forward in the last 2 or 3 years, there's become this great emphasis, right, on jack of all trades. You've got to know everything. If you have this great diverse background, then you can intersect and work in a multitude of fields, right? You can add value to all of the parts that you're contributing to. And so I think it's kind of fascinating how we've come full circle. I suspect at some point it'll go back to specialization down the road and back and forth, but just an interesting observation about how that intersects with innovation and creativity and contributing in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's so. When I was at Verizon, they kind of encouraged us to move. Same thing with Google; they want you to try out new different things. But I think our audience from Builders of Web3 will be very happy with that. So, in the Web3 blockchain world, they have some. I think like they call it unicorn is you know some data science, and then you also can like hold your own in like coding and develop software development. But then also you have to know a little bit of design and stuff. And now it's even getting more complicated because you have to manage a community, like a Discord community. That's a totally different skill, you know. So yeah. That's it's definitely an interesting world, which I think will come up because it could definitely get overwhelming. So I wanted to ask you first, how did you guys get into first we'll take a step back, right? So we don't talk about innovation, and when I was trying to come up with questions and when I was thinking about it, I kept coming to the word creativity. So if we start two-part question, like what is innovation? And then is it the same thing as creativity?
I would just say as like a more useful general answer to start with is that to just see that they're the same thing. You know, a lot of people want to say innovation is about making something creative functional and have a purpose and work. But, you know, it's kind of like just slicing and dicing the same big space. And I think the really important thing for us is that creativity is a process. It's not a thing. It's not something that you could own or possess. It's not something like we could chop your head open and find it inside you. You know, there's no genetic coding for it. It's a worldly process, right? And it's something we can enter into, and we see it all around us. You know, dinosaurs are evolving into birds, you know, new viruses are emerging all the time. It's, you know, so that's the really important thing for us is to get people to move from that thing model where it's something in a so-called creative's head to seeing it as a worldly process that we participate in. And some of those things lead to very concrete outcomes, you know, which some people want to call innovation, and some things lead to much more speculative outcomes, which you might say, oh, that's more, you know, about creativity. But I think getting lost in the nuance, like, makes you not see the important big picture part.
So but I think I found something very interesting that you said. Are you saying that creativity is like, you're not born with that? Because I used to think like, let's say accountants are not creative, and then are people who are into like the liberal arts, maybe they're more creative. And I went for 25 years basically of my life, and I'm 26 now, thinking that I wasn't creative at all, and I thought I could never do such a thing. And I know a lot of people who share that same belief. Yeah,
I think it's totally misplaced. I would just say, like, obviously, if you're from New Jersey, you know that accounting is incredibly creative, yes. Especially, you know. But that aside, yeah, I think it's this fundamental error we've made that's part of our history and tradition coming from a kind of Greco-Christian philosophy where, God is the creator and prime mover, and then we've modeled our own model of creativity on that, like that it's something internal and some people are creative and some people aren't. And it's really a set of skills that are across the board, applied across the board, and can be learned and engaged with by anyone. And I think it's really important to see it's also it's a non-human thing, right? It's like all around us. Amazing things are happening, and a big part of the creativity we're involved with as humans is because of some strange non-human, unintended creativity. Antibiotics is the creativity of microscopic fungi.
Wow, never thought about it that way.
It's not like we figured out how to work with them, but it's not like it was like somebody invented it in their head and then was like, I'm going to make the world do it.
So you guys have your consulting company. Do you guys work more with individuals or more with companies? And how do you start teaching that stuff?
So I think it's a bit of a mix across consulting with individuals in deep intensives and meaningful ways. It's professional personal development and corporate engagements, from workshops to long-term engagements. But how do we do it is really, I think, what really set us on this path to forming Emergent Futures Lab. And really, we're trying to answer two questions, which is what is innovation, which I think Iain was just touching upon, but how to innovate. And so in that research lab that I was describing, Iain and I were sitting there reflecting upon, the semesters of work, and realizing that students were just generating widgetized outcomes. They were just slightly better versions of what existed. They didn't really have great impact. They were not maybe contributing to the positive change that we need in our socioeconomic, ecosystemic environments at this point in time. And what we started to kind of break down is, one, it was based on the pillar of design thinking, which was handed to us in the beginning. Iain and I are both the first professors in the program, the curriculum, and it was decided that we would begin with design thinking as a pillar of our curriculum. And then the second was, so we were evaluating that as a widgetized outcome of design thinking, but then started to look through all of the books that are on entrepreneurship and innovation and startups, and they all proclaim the importance of innovation. And it's about a sentence somewhere early, or a paragraph at most early in the book. And then that's it, nothing else about it. And so when you look in the index of the books, there was no mention of innovation or creativity. And when you look in the table of contents, there's no mention of creativity or innovation. And specifically, and all it was stating was just how important, how you must do this great important thing, but no process.
No one tells you how to do it.
And right, there was no how to. And so that's the second question that we are focusing on answering: how to innovate. And so we've generated a process, over the last bunch of years that mimics, I think, much of what Iain was just describing, right? Getting outside of the head and being of and emergent with creativity processes that are all around us, and coming up with a framework and approach to generating creativity and innovation, so that even individuals like yourself that feel they're not creative, right, can participate in the process of creativity and innovation.
Yeah, no, that is awesome. And that's why I've been reading your newsletter, because, right, so I create content, and I have what we're filming right now, right? And like, how can I do something different? Because I'm just doing it. A lot of times you just get stuck in the process, and just everybody else is doing it this way, so this is how you continue to do it. Yeah. But it gets very saturated. You're not standing out. People get bored. I want people to get value out of this. So that's why I've been spending a lot of time trying to think. But at the same time, I just sit on, let's say I just sit on my couch and be like, okay, I'm going to innovate now and I'm going to come up with a new way. Every idea that comes to me, something that kind of I've seen somewhere or heard about. So then by the nature of it, that I'm not innovating, right? I'm just trying to copy somebody else's thing.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you raise, and that's that's like the nature of thinking, and ideation is conservative, right? Like, so if you can have that, if you can turn it into words and concepts, you're going back, you're going to the past, you're going to what's known. And so there, you need to figure out a way of going beyond, what you can ideate and what you can think. And that's where, you have to have an experimental approach. Like, you have to look at, like you're saying with what we're doing right now, we're recording something in a certain way. But if you just looked at all the components of it and you asked yourself, like, what else could they do? And started to experiment with that. Like, let's not do the standard model, like, whatever that might be. Let's just block those key parts. What else could it do if we did that? And then to start, play with that. Like, well, that leads to this really interesting thing. What else could that interesting thing do? And then iterate and keep going. And at some point, these kind of exploratory processes hit on a threshold where it crosses into something qualitatively different. And then, then you're off to the races. But if you just sit in your couch, which is a wonderful thing, and you just like smoke dope and, generate ideas, or you do it in a boardroom and you call it brainstorming, or you do it with like a innovation expert in a workshop where you're led to supposedly novel ideas. It's all the same thing. It's just conservative idea generation, and it's like, that's part of the problem.
So how do you get past that? Are we able to talk about through, like, maybe, I know there's a lot of techniques, right? That's why there's a whole playbook for it, but able to give a kind of like an example or maybe one technique. I know you mentioned blocking.
Yeah, I think blocking is blocking is really the best way to start and really get yourself to understand the processes we're talking about. Or just look at anything you do, whatever it might be, and think of what's one underlying tool, process, habit, and just say, I'm not doing that. And then it'll force you to figure, to do something differently with things. You might need to add a couple more blockages, but you're just pushing yourself into the unintended, like using things in unintended ways, using things in different, and then you start to notice that some of those are really interesting.
So are you guys, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah,
that's cool.
So are you guys familiar with NFTs?
Yeah.
Nice JPEGs online, right? Yeah. It's very popular. Everybody's doing that. But all it is, everybody's just posting a picture of the same different ape or different orangutan, and it's just being copied, right? So would you say an example of blocking would be if you try to innovate, right? Like, how can we take NFTs to the next level? Would an example of blocking be like, okay, we're not going to post a picture as an NFT, and then you block that kind of site, and maybe you are going to use the other senses. Like, can I send you a voice message that's unique to you? Would that be kind of like you started to using different senses, or am I off on that?
That could be super interesting. I think the important thing is don't think of like the next thing you're doing as an answer, but as like the beginning of a process. Like, so you block, sending JPEGs and you try something else. It's not like you're just trying to replace one thing with another, but you're trying to start a journey, right? That will involve iteration and more blocking and more deviation. And eventually you'll get somewhere interesting. But that first step will probably, like the one you're suggesting, it'll sound, even when you say it, kind of stupid, right? You're like, like, I'm not even sure what I'm saying, use a different sense. Like, isn't that already been done as well? That would just be stupid. Nobody would want it. But it's more important just to do it. And then see, well, what's interesting in it, in the sense of like, what's different, and how could I magnify that and take it further? How could I block a bit more? And it has to be really exploratory, right? Where I think we want to know before we experiment where we're going to go. Like, this is going to be really cool. We'll get into that space. But that's also like pulling us back into what we know. So I think it's important to recognize like the emotions you're having, like where you're like, that's kind of dumb, that's kind of stupid, but be willing to try it out and trust the process, right? And not have to have the answer.
So you're saying,
I would just add,
go ahead.
I would just add a bit there here in that you can control how much you block or how much difference you generate by how many of the variables you leave behind, right? And so if you understand all the elements of an NFT, right, it's imagery, it's color, it's generally profile pictures, right? It's based on code, a certain type of code, a structure of code, specific languages of code, right? And so then if we start to understand the entire field of NFTs, right, but also understand their possibilities beyond just this one use case that we're seeing repeated over and over. So to generate the difference, we can block some of those variables to generate a little bit of difference, right? For example, we could block a color palette, right? Or we could then start to block imagery, right? And start to get into other senses, right? So now we're becoming more different. And then we could block many more variables like, hey, we're going to block this way of coding, or we're going to block this traditional form of code that has to be in all the NFTs and generate some entirely new, let the code generate, right? Because it's all based on code. Let the code take us into some entirely new place, right? And I'm sure someone right now is laughing, like, and they're saying, like, you can't do that, right? Like, you can't block code for something you're coding. That's fucking ridiculous. But that's how you get to somewhere different, right? So the more variables you block, the more difference you generate. And it's that laughter that Iain was kind of touching upon, the dumb or the crazy, the stupid. Laughter is the human response to new and difference. If it were something familiar, we wouldn't be laughing. We'd be comfortable with it.
That is true. Yeah.
Right. And so when you're generating that sort of laughter, you know you're onto something that's worth exploring and then just treating all of those as experimental questions, as opposed to the answer. Right. And so that experimental question you put forth of, maybe it's an audio file. Great. Maybe it is an audio file. It's not all that different, but it's a start. Right. And instead of it being the answer, we're going to now deliver audio files. Let's just explore where that takes us and what's possible and see where it leads and keep experimenting.
But how do you, like you said, if it sounds dumb to you, right? And you think this is a ridiculous idea, but you're saying you still have to kind of give it a try, because those things I think are like kind of conflicting in us, right? If we think something's dumb, we don't want to go to our friends and be like, this is what I'm going to do. And people are going to laugh at you basically, right? So how do you kind of encourage people to just put it on?
I mean, that's where we like to invent a lot of games that can get you familiar with these processes, in kind of low kind of risk environments, right? Which is what a game is. And because I think the other part is like when you say these concepts to people, they're like, either you don't quite understand them or you also think they're wrong. Like, I know what innovation is. I know what creativity is. I'm a creative person. I want to generate big ideas and speculative fictions and whatever it might be. So I think rather than talking a lot, we try in our workshops and in other scenarios to immerse people in, games and events and situations and then unpack them. And so that the things we're saying are sort of self-generated by the participants. And, they're having the realizations. So it's not coming from us so much as it's coming from the situation. So I think that's a really important part, is like, you know, we've learned from, you know, through our schooling, like to be idea and concept focused, and, you know, answer driven, and not experimental and exploratory. You know, so you have to learn new techniques and, you know, lose bad habits and skills.
I'd also just add that, you know, it takes a bit of courage, right, to be different. It takes courage to be an innovator. You know, all fascinating, you know, you know, Iain likes to use the horseshit example a lot as an example. You know, in the late 1800s, you know, there's a horseshit problem in every metropolis that's becoming overcrowded, right? If you suggested to them we'd be moving to combustion engines as a solution, they'd laugh at you, right?
Right.
Right. I mean, like every new sort of new innovation is going to be met with skepticism. Skepticism because it's uncomfortable. Skepticism because you cannot imagine the future in this way. Skepticism because you're challenging the norms and frameworks in which some people have built their entire lives and careers upon, and you're threatening them, right? Like the people that were making horse saddles were like, fuck, if you are going to build a combustible engine, I don't think it's possible, but if you do, right, like I'm going to be out of business. So I'm sure as hell not going to, you know, buy into that, you know, possibility, you know. So there's all sorts of restriction, you know, against you moving the sticks forward in some new entire way, and that's gonna require some bravery and sticking your neck out a bit too.
Yeah, and I think the thing I think of is like, if you get it wrong and it's like, I told you so, and I told you it wasn't gonna work, but then how? I think that's the second thing is, okay, you try something, let's say you have the courage, and me just starting this podcast, you know, it took courage. If it doesn't work out, you know, or the episode, let's say by episode 10, people aren't watching it. How do you get, or you're innovating, how do you get yourself to stick through it, right? Because people are pointing at you. I told you this wasn't going to work. Combustion, right? This was never a thing. Horses are better. So how do you keep going through it? You keep just iterating and.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing with like the new, like with something genuinely novel, nobody can guarantee that you're going to be successful. Like the idea that, you know, perseverance will lead to success, there's nothing we can say about it. Like, I mean, literally, it's genuinely new. It could be that on the next iteration, some novel threshold emerges, you cross it, there's something cool. It could turn out that you work on this forever and there's nothing. That, you know, like that way of exploring the space of potentiality is just, you know, it's a giant desert. So, you know, I think the hard part is like, as humans, you have to gamble, you know, but I think you can set yourself up, especially like if we come back into this, you know, the world of artificial life and artificial intelligence, is you can, you know, use the power of, you know, designing large scale, you know, algorithmic processes to explore spaces of potential far beyond what you could think of, you know. And so setting up, you know, these kind of experimental generations of possibility are now what you see a lot of companies doing. Like the pharmaceutical world is full of it. You have like generative engines in design fields. You know, we're using all of these things to explore spaces of possibility. So there's new models and methods to do it. But I think the important thing is, at an existential level, is we're working without guarantees. You know, the other thing to say about what Jason was saying with bravery, I think one of the really important parts of that is that if you're successfully innovative, you're also betraying everybody, like
Yeah.
he was saying. But, and I think that psychologically that betrayal is really hard. If you look in the arts, like we like to use the example of John Cage, who was, a famous 20th century composer. His most important work of art was a silent piece of music, but it's like, for all of his colleagues and friends who are also composers and musicians, it's kind of like a giant fuck you.
Yeah.
It's meant, it's not meant to be like an ironic work or even a critical work. But at the same time, it's like hard not to see it as like you're saying, you guys are all irrelevant. Like
Right.
Everything you do is beside the point. And that's, I think that's really challenging.
And I think I see that a lot in the blockchain world, right? So we have, let's say, different cryptocurrencies, and it's all about decentralization. But then somebody comes along and they're like, well, maybe we don't have to be fully decentralized. Maybe we could have somebody in power, because you get hacked, you call your bank now. In the blockchain world, if you get hacked, nobody. So now there's some companies and some coins that are coming out, and they're like, okay, we're going to be decentralized, but we might have a few things here and there that if you do get hacked, we can give you your money back. And then on Twitter, and especially with social media, people just go at you, oh my God, how can you do this? This is not the whole point. And you're like, all right, so I get it, it's not fully decentralized, and the whole point of the blockchain was decentralization, but maybe it's needed somewhere. So I can definitely see, like you're saying, kind of going against what's expected and going against the norm. You could definitely make some enemies, especially today. People are so loud on social media.
Yeah.
That's a big problem with decentralization is, right. I mean, it's very hard to achieve true decentralization. And in this particular case, there are some good reasons maybe not to be decentralized, which is why they had, come up with alternative mechanisms to have some decentralization. I think the big mistake there is still calling it a decentralized anything, right? That's the problem. If they actually renamed it something else and embraced the difference that they are creating and the difference that they are, generating, right? Then you can avoid some of that conflict and be somewhere entirely new. But they were afraid to do that, right? They didn't have the courage to be something entirely new. You lose some of that marketing sweep, right, of calling yourself decentralized, right? But did it work out for them if there's that much blowback, right? And so I think it gets back to that whole thing of betrayal and bravery and what it means to be an innovator, because they may have it entirely right. I think it's too early for any of us to say, right, at this point, as things are evolving.
The market will say, right? You make something and you let the market decide versus you trying to put it into a corner. So how about when you're like innovating and you're going through this, how do you make sure that you are totally not going down the wrong path? Or is there a wrong path? I guess it's the question just by speaking to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the wrong, like if we're talking from the perspective of innovation, so the perspective of like a qualitatively different something emerging. So, so then you can say what's wrong. What would be wrong is to not have something novel, which is to say to repeat what you already have to some degree. So it's that's for us that, the definition of wrong is that you've lost your difference. You've just reproduced the same. And I think it's a really useful thing to keep in mind, to always like figure out how to follow that difference further. And I think it's a good example with, distributed models. And I think, blockchain is just a small example, but if you look at complexity science, reality is inherently distributed, nonlinear, emergent, and and you can start to see that there are answers to the questions of is it all bottom up, or is there also some top down part? And emergent causality is like where you have distributed systems producing cohesive wholes where the whole makes the parts, right? So that you have system causality, which is, it's getting a little off track, but, I think, the answer always from the perspective of innovation is that you want to figure out how not to reproduce the same. And it's just that it might need to be a different difference, so if there's a problem, like how do you get your money back in crypto? It's not like we have to go back to the 19th century and have a banker somewhere that gives you your money. I think we can push the difference further to figure it out. The obvious solution, because we already know it, is to go get a banker.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
That's exactly what's happening.
But the other answer, isn't to get ideological about distributed systems, but is to actually explore them further, which is to say, push the difference into new differences.
Okay, yeah. I think basically what you're saying, the only thing you will be wrong is if you test it out, and if you're trying to build a product and nobody's buying it, maybe that's kind of when you start to pivot, right? Because you wanna make something, but you don't, at the same time, you don't want to be delusional, because I've seen, I watch a lot of Shark Tank, and there will be some people like, this is new, this doesn't exist, and they're like, well, how much sales do you have? And they're like, well, we have a $10,000 in the last 3 years, and the person like, okay, this doesn't work. So
yeah,
that's
different. That's a different question. That's which is to say, if you ask me how to make something radically new, but if you want to have it to be radically new and have impact, now we're adding another thing to it, which I think is what Jason's about to get to.
Yeah, and you'll remember this, right, from our time together in university, Antonio, which is at some point you take your radically new, right, and you determine how it meets how it intersects with the wants and needs of end users. Right. And so that's where the design thinking, and Iain and I are often accused of hating design thinking. We don't hate design thinking at all. We think it's important, has a place. We just believe it comes at the end of the process, as opposed to the start of the process. And this is where design thinking principles, and whether you're doing lean startup or co-evolution, customer discovery, customer validation, essentially they're all the same thing, which is to empathize with your end user. And so you're taking your radically new, right? And now you're bringing it to others to find out, does it meet their wants and needs? Does it solve their problems? How is it doing so well? Where's it missing the mark? Taking that feedback, building it back in and iterating, right? Until you generate something, right, that is qualitatively new, meeting wants and users' needs, solving their problems to the point where they're willing to pay for it. And then the biggest problem, that people have with this long-winded process that Iain and I have been kind of describing is they want this fast, right? They want to do this in a week.
That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, how do I do this in a week? Well, that doesn't really work well in a week, right? Innovation's a slow, long, hard process. Validating anything is a slow, long, hard process. And whenever you skip any of these parts, try to rush it, move quickly, you're going to betray the possibility of something radically new, or you're going to end up in world of confirmation bias, right? Because you've got to be right to get something somewhere, some end point, right? Or you're going to end up, failing in the last part of that component I was describing, which was generating the revenue in exchange, right, for the wants and needs, because you went too quickly and you skipped the part of truly understanding what people want and need. And so, there's nobody likes to hear that there's no quick answer here. It's a process. It's a long process, and it's open-ended. It never really ends. And there's no way to prescribe a timeline to it.
Yeah, and that was the kind of the big thing that I was thinking about, especially with today's world. Everything is very fast. Every day you open up Twitter, you open up LinkedIn, somebody's coming up with a new way, there's a new coin, there's a new NFT, just take it back to the Web3. And I feel like if I'm not doing something, or like if I'm not producing anything right away, you feel like you're lagging behind, because things are changing. But then you end up copying the same thing that everybody's doing. And in the short
Antonio,
term,
if we think about that for a minute, right? Like that new thing that's showing up in your timeline, right? That new NFT, you're like, oh, I didn't think of that. Like, I got to do that now, right? What I think is being overlooked and ignored is how much time and energy somebody put into generating that new, right? And so it's new to you, right? And that's this whole misnomer of overnight successes. I tend to kind of harp on, and I'll spend a minute on it, right? Because there's no such thing as an overnight success. Right. It's just overnight has shown up in your feed, whichever feed you're consuming, right? Now it's new to you, but what's been ignored is the 9 years of work that's gone into that moment. And that person's unique ability maybe in the last 3 or 6 months to pull all of their experiences together to generate this new thing that's showing up in your feed. Or it's been in the feed for 3 or 4 years and you just never saw it. Mm-hmm. And what is really new, right? Is it new to you? Is it new to them? Is it new to the end user? What is, then we can get into all sorts of different things there. So the point is that even if you see something new and unique in your feed and you're like, oh, I got to do that now, it's still going to take you time to generate and create that. And so I think it's this kind of like sticking to your guns, right? Like find some new radical path to follow and follow it, right? Like own it and see it through. And in some period of time, I don't know what it is. It's 9 days, 9 months, 9 years. It's going to show up in somebody else's feed as new.
That's very, very good points you make there, and kind of like, it makes me realize, somebody's been playing, and by the time you copy it, there's something new. It makes me think that like when I'm doing something and if I see reacting like that, probably maybe when you're working on something, turn off social media for like a couple weeks or a month or something, and just stick with your guns until you are working on, because there's always something shiny out there. You take a break, and they say like you take a 24 hours break from Twitter, by the time you come back, like hundreds of things have happened in the Web3 world. But at the same time, now when I'm thinking about it, talking to you guys, how many of those things are just like repeating themselves or just the same thing over again? So it's that FOMO, right? The fear of missing out on something that's making me focus on the short term rather than like the long.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's like a couple things there as well, that you really need to get a pulse on the entire ecosystem that you're interested in, so that, like the NFT is just one little peak in this, vast sea of rethinking distributed systems, emergence, what have you. And if you're able to understand that, it's, then you're not just responding to these, immediate 5-minute changes in the world, but you can see, I think this is another thing we're really interested in helping people, is you can see that there's like an assemblage of things, types of code, what have you, all of these parts, and they give rise to a field of possibility. In that field of possibility, you'll see NFTs over here, cryptocurrencies over there, blockchain security over here, but they're all just an emergent field of connected possibilities that the system has produced, that we can explore, the assemblage has produced, and not to get fixated in thinking of each one as a discrete thing or a discrete space. The other thing I'd say is, like, if you want to be both novel and successful, I think the other part is you have to co-emerge with others from the beginning. You know, if it's just you in your bat cave, you know, doing whatever you're doing, you're not building a world and an ecosystem in a space, and you're just at the end of it going to pop out with something that doesn't fit anywhere in reality. You know, so you have to kind of co-emerge with a new reality that involves others and, you know, building environments and habits and practices and tools and systems. You know, like you can't invent the first car if you're not also inventing like a road. If you're not inventing how you fill up with gas, if you're not inventing, you know, the pleasure and the desire of a new type of movement, you know, and so you have to co-emerge all of that. And I think, like, you know, you can't just bring it to customers later, because the customers are going to be very happy with what they have.
Yeah.
You know, and so you have to make, you know, you're making all of that in the same space.
You know, you guys make some very good points. So going back to kind of, you know, or shifting a little bit of the gears, how does one find that time for innovation, for that kind of like, you know, I have work, you know, there's a baby and the things are happening and you want to get everything done. Would you like block out times, or is that like a continuous going on? Do you have anything like any tips, advice on how we can do that?
I think it's really, you said it, you're blocking out time. I think it's, you know, like it's one of these things where it's long term, you don't know where it's going to lead. So it always gets punted down the road. It's like,
yeah,
you know, like I got some chore I got to do now, there's something else. I think it's really important to block out time. I would say it's also not something that works well, like where I just say, like, I'm going to put, you know, 2 hours on Thursday and then 2 hours on, I don't know, Tuesdays, and that'll be enough. But there has to be a period, you know, this is going to sound crazy, but like, you know, half a year where you just don't do anything else.
Wow.
Type thing. You know, there's this, a really great example that we like to point to is this famous restaurant in Spain that invented molecular gastronomy called El Bulli. You know, and they, every year they closed for 6 months and they completely shut the restaurant. And then they went to a separate workshop, laboratory. And in that laboratory, the rule was they had to do something that was genuinely new. And they couldn't, the goal wasn't to make any new dishes. You know, like, so nothing to do with their final product of, you know, in a sense, what the restaurant sells as dishes. But the goal of the 6 months in the lab was to come up with new techniques, new processes, new frameworks, new methodologies. And then they would figure out later how to turn those into dishes. So that's like a super radical example, which might not be possible. I could see, like, if you're a larger company, for example, you can just permanently have, you know, a whole cohort of people in an innovation lab that are doing this. You know, but if you're like an individual trying to work on something, I think you need to, you know, be blocking out on a weekly basis some time, but there has to be somewhere where you get together with others and you're just like, for these 2 weeks, you know, whatever time is possible, you're like, we're focused on this. You know, because there's something about that time that allows the unexpected to happen. You know, and if you don't have time for the unexpected because you're like, I only got an hour to work on this shit, you know, it's not that viable.
I'd add that, you know, it's also these concepts, these techniques, part of the process. is something to practice in your daily habits, right? So, the easiest thing to do would be start using your non-dominant hand to do some things, to understand ways to interact, right? Like blocking the use of your non-dominant hand. It could be as cooking, right? Like I'm going to make eggs, but I'm not going to use, Iain likes to say heat, which makes it really hard, but maybe something else, even altogether, right? But so cooking's a nice way to be able to block ingredients, right? And take recipes in sorts of new directions. But it's as simple as, walking to your car in a new path, right? To allow, nature and experience to kind of hit you, right? So, and see what you discover in that new walk and that new path, or so there's all sorts of ways to practice being more creative in your daily life, which I think then feeds into what Iain was describing, which is if you want to be creative, just as if you'd like to build a reading habit or a coding habit, right? It's just to block time and get it on your schedule and commit to it. If it's important to you, you'll do that, right? You'll find time. And then last, people always say, well, there's not enough time in the day. And I think then the answer is always to sleep faster. There is no need for 8-hour days of sleeping, just one day a week, 8 hours, and then every other day is 4 or 5. And you can do magical things that way.
I like that.
That's a tough one, Frasca.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing at work when I'm trying to, you want to come up with something new, but you have 10 things in your backlog you're trying to finish. So you're like, okay, I want to focus, but there's so much distraction, so much noise. And there's also pressure on short-term goals, right? The company doesn't want to say you're going to accomplish something in 10 years. They want to see in the next quarterly review or the next revenue readout, they want to see change or they want to see improvement.
Yeah. And so then it's like those are kind of ecosystems, business ecosystems that are just like unsustainable. It goes back to what Jason was saying at the beginning, where like everybody's talking about creativity or innovation, but if you want to know how to do it, it's not going to look like that, where you're, driving people to short-term goals, quarterly growth figures that are insane. That might be good for your business, but that's certainly not going to be helpful for innovation.
But perhaps there's some balance in between, which would be in saying super important, and then the reality of short-term goals are important too. And so doing the work, right, and at the end of the quarter, demonstrating the value that you've created, the value that you've captured, and the work that you're doing, right, and get some people excited about how you're going about generating change and some of the things that you're onto and exploring, right? And so maybe it's not this end, this perfect product at the end, which most people would like both in their personal life and businesses, right? But if you're showing the path that you're on and showing the work that you're doing and the change you're generating and that you're invested in the process, I think that you can get a lot of people pretty excited about where you're headed, because they can then finally, become a collaborator with you, right? A partner in the journey, as opposed to this, there's always, Iain and I talk about this too, when we do like corporate engagements, that the boardroom or some executive wants to hire innovation consultants, right? And then just you go do that over there, right? Make my people innovative. It's like, no, we've all got to buy into this, right? Like you've got to be into it too. You've got to understand the process. You've got to be a part of the innovation so that you understand and can be a part, right? And so you'd be from the bottom up recruiting those that are asking you to create change, right? And getting them to buy in and see the path that you're on so that you can have the time and freedom and the flexibility then to create something magnificent without maybe that immediate constraint of time.
I would also say, Frasca, instead of sleep faster, there's there's just also the trend to work faster. Like we don't need, to work whatever it is 7 days a week. The type of work we're doing, we could get done in, 2 days. These much shorter work days, like 4-hour work days, 6-hour work days, turn out to be incredibly productive. But just, so I think it's like changing the environment of work, the habits and practices of work, the tools and techniques. That all really matters if you want genuine innovation to play a role. And that's got to really shift.
Yeah,
totally agree and subscribe to that, Iain. That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
So I know we don't have too much left. So one thing I wanted to touch on is, I know I mentioned your book. Some people might want to buy the book or check it out after listening to this conversation. What can expect? Is there like a book where I can sit down and it's going to teach me how to be more innovative? And like, how do you want to talk a little bit about the book and why'd you write it?
Yeah, it's really, as Jason was saying early on, like it's the what and the how. So the book is kind of, the first third is offering a better model of creativity and innovation, like we've been talking about, and then the second 2/3 is really walking people through the techniques of doing that. The how. I think one thing that is great in the book, Jason, if you got it right in front of you, is like it's full of like drawings, diagrams. It's really focused on process. The other thing I would say is, if you're buying 99.9999% of the books you get out there in the innovation and business space, they're basically a blog post that somebody expanded pointlessly into a book.
Yes.
And they're, it's kind of like designed for executives to have some buzzword, and you just buy it and it's pointless, or you already know it, or you get it in 5 seconds. This book is like the inverse of that. It's super rich. It's full of, there's like no wasted crap. So I think we said something like, if you could turn to any page in this book, and if you don't find a concept that you could apply or use that day, we'll give you your money back. Because unlike, all that shit you find in the airport about, whatever business, something, choose your topic, where there's just like one sentence and the rest is toilet paper. We're really trying to like make sure there's value here. And so, that was our goal, is like, write a real book. Otherwise we'd have just done a blog post. And as Jason was saying too, we've been working on, writing this book since we started working together.
Oh, wow.
We've gone through, like, to talk about iteration, we've gone through maybe 35 different iterations, starting from handouts, that we would use in workshops with students and businesses, to slowly compiling it into this thing. So it
wasn't an overnight success story.
And Iain used the right word, like, it's the inverse of a blog post. Our blog posts are actually generated from the concepts of the book, as opposed to us writing blog posts and like putting them in some order of a table of contents and saying, here's a book, right? So the book was written long before any of the content on the site. So the site and our work on LinkedIn really is and our blog, our weekly blog, our newsletter especially, is an opportunity for us to take the book exponentially deeper into these concepts and explore them with, all sorts of examples, some of which we shared today, taking very, very specific concepts and going much deeper down the rabbit hole with them and the research behind them and so forth. So we're having a lot of fun with that right now, and kind of churning out a lot of content around it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So how do you guys think about, so this is more not from the innovation perspective, but more from the content creator perspective. We have some audience who likes to create content. How do you balance between that, right? Like you have long content, but people really need to commit to it, right? It's not the typical LinkedIn content or Twitter where it's 140 characters or a short paragraph and people just move on to the next thing. Do you struggle with that?
So I think Iain and I have vastly different writing styles. So that's, I think, the first thing, but to our benefit. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the second thing is everybody wants something short and quick, right? And so we've blocked that. And we're just not going to be bound by the norms of whatever a newsletter is supposed to be, look like, have, or feel. We're going to explore a concept as deeply as we think makes sense. And we've had a couple of 1,000-word newsletter issues go out, and some people are like, "Hey, do you have a podcast version of this? I don't have 40 minutes to read a newsletter." And we that's why we send it on a Friday. It's like, hey, this is good, like Sunday reading, coffee reading, fireplace reading in the wintertime. It's deep. It's definitely deep. It's definitely heady. But then what we do is, and going back to the first point I made, which is we have very different writing styles, where I prefer to style my writing after Hemingway, short, direct, succinct. Iain, prefers, I think Iain would one day like to write one newsletter with one sentence, like the whole thing will be one sentence. We're not right. And they're both right. There's no wrong. And I think, and that's, I think, one of the best parts of writing. We get hung up in these styles, and it goes back to your content creation of these podcasts and these videos on YouTube, right? There's some standardization that's always happening, right? Like evolving of what the best practice of content creation is. And if you want to stand out, do it differently, right? Yeah. Block what's being done and create differently. And the closest thing I would say is that we're like maybe, what's her name that does the Marginella, the Sunday reads, I forgot her name, but she's got those really long, beautiful, blog posts that don't adhere to the norms at all. And I'd like to think we're kind of following that a little bit more. The other thing is this: from day one, we blocked stock imagery. We were not going to have any humans unless it's us in some way, but we're not going to do pictures of people, and we're not going to use any stock photography. And so every image that you see, we've generated either hand-drawn, and most of the hand-drawns, Iain, the bad hand-drawn ones are mine. and then I'll use some computer software, to generate other types of imagery as well. But there's no pictures.
Yeah, no, I definitely can attest to that, because I remember, one of the first things I saw when I subscribed to you guys, it was like the Roman or the ancient Greeks in this year. I'm like, oh my God, are we starting like 4,000 years ago? When are we gonna get to like how to actually innovate? So it was definitely at first it's a style, and it's a heavy read, but pushing through it. And then I see where it leads up to. But I mean, to be like extremely honest, I think, right, you guys, if you wanted to generate more views and things to go viral more, you probably would do short content and stuff. But you have your audience, you have what you want to accomplish, right? Because it's not just a number of LinkedIn followers. I've seen that, right? You can have 100,000 LinkedIn followers, but if there's no engagement or people are not learning anything, then it might not be as useful. So I really that's
really the part, is that our audience is a lot of practitioners of innovation, and people who are leading workshops in innovation, who are doing this kind of work within corporations and nonprofits and what have you, and they've already read all that short useless shit, and they've already been to countless keynote speeches by somebody who just sounds great. And, so they're coming out of the experience of a frustration of like just, the same shit being served to them, and then the same methods, like, getting watered down. So we found like the more we actually deliver something of value, we just focus on that, the stronger and the deeper the engagement is. And and for us, the goal is to engage with people off these platforms, like to really work with them and develop new ways of innovating with people that make, real world changes. So I think delivering value is, leads to those things where, like you're saying, we could pivot and get whatever 100,000 followers. I'm not sure if we could, if we're that skilled at that game, which takes great skill, but it wouldn't have a point,
right?
And I think that's the part, like I would say, like if you're generating content, like if it's just to be able to say I have 1 million followers, like, is that really what you're after? Or are you really trying to have some type of impact? And that would be the other part I'd say is like, if 50 of the right people read your content and then that rippled out through the world, that would be that's impact. If 1 million people read it, but it's just the thing they're going through and the 15,000 things they look at in a day, that's pointless. So I think it's really, for us, we've really spent a lot of time trying to attune ourselves to those people, and as we see what the feedback we get, we change that, so it's very responsive, but it's not responsive to getting like another 5,000 likes.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, you guys know what you're after, right? And if somebody is after the millions of followers, nothing wrong with that, right? If it's entertainment or even if it's educational, right? There are some things you can learn, but you are going after a certain audience, and you're sticking to it. So props to you guys, because I know there's definitely a lot of outside noises that could try to kind of derail that. So I know we're at time. I had a lot more topics too, also to talk about, but I mean we covered plenty, and I want to be respectful of your time. I definitely learned a lot from you guys today. Hopefully you had fun as much as I did. And cool. in the show notes, and I'll post your website, and we can link the newsletter you guys have for people who want to follow it and listen to it and read it. And maybe one day we'll be listening to your own podcast, the Emergent Futures podcast. So
yeah, I suspect that'll happen at some point. We've dabbled in those sorts of things, and it's just about time, right? But
right.
This has been a lot of fun, Antonio. It's been a pleasure to chat with you on such a high level after a former student, right? So super cool to see you in such a great place, and this was great. And we'd love to do it again. If you'll have us back, we can keep that conversation going that you'd like to have.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the conversation can never end, so we'll definitely have to do it again. Thank you.
Dynamite.
Well,
thanks so much.